Hey, it's Random Code here, and today I want to showcase how and when we should use an optional in Java. So I already created a very simple setup where I'm not using optionals, but where I would be using null. And mainly, the concept of optional is that we would like to remove null with the optional object in Java, which makes everything a bit prettier and a bit cleaner. So I have this very simple setup where I have a data handler, which would normally be my database or my connection to an API. I then use this data handler to get some data. I have a data object, which is just very simply plain Java object containing an ID, some data, and a number. I can set these values, I can get and set them, and I can print it as a whether to string. I then, inside my data handler, simply have a random as well, where I can check when retrieving the data just to make it a bit different, that sometimes it returns null, otherwise it returns a data object. So what we would like to do is now choose an optional and get rid of all the nulls. And simply just to firstly define what is an optional. An optional is just simply a type in Java, which is able to hold some kind of object. In this case, it's going to be holding our data. And for now, I would just create an empty optional. I would not initialize it yet. I would then, inside my data handler, instead of returning a data as my object, I would return an optional containing my data. Then what we can do instead of returning null, I would define here as well an optional containing my data. I would then simply define, instead of having if my boolean is true, so in this case if something random happens, I would return null. I would then instead set my data point to be equal to optional.empty. So this is kind of the same as doing a null, but later on it allows us to simply just check directly on our object if it's empty or not. And when doing multiple mappings and changing our data throughout time, throughout multiple systems, this makes everything a bit more cleaner and a bit nicer to read. So we would simply go, if something random happens, our data is now going to be empty. Otherwise, then again, this is actually probably the main point that's a bit different, is that we end up using an else instead, which some people prefer, some people don't. So that's kind of like the other end of the stick. Optionals get rid of all the nulls, which is a bonus, but sometimes we need to add a bunch of extra else, which is not always preferred. But we then, instead of returning it down here, I would just say, if something is not happening, I would set my data to be equal to an optional dot off, and then I would give it my new data point. So we now simply just define that we are returning an optional on a getData method. We set up an optional. We then check if something random happens. Our data is going to be an empty optional. Otherwise, it's going to be an optional containing our data point. And then we simply have only also got rid of the two returns. So now we're simply returning one thing, which very simply is our data. We remove the null, simply just have a single check, and we now return our data point as an optional. We then, when retrieving our data from a data handler, of course, it's just going to be our data. And now we can then use the optional. So we would simply go and check if our data is, depending on what we want to do in this case, we want to do if it is present, we would like to print out the data. Or in some cases, probably more often than not, we would like to check if our data is empty. We would like to do something specific. And what's ended up being the case is this is way easy to read, because it's just, the functionality is as it says. Simply go, if our data is empty, do something. It's just, in this case, I'll print out empty, for example. So if our data is empty, print out empty. Otherwise, if our data is present, print out the data. So instead of having a bunch of codes with a bunch of null checks, now we can simply check and it's easier to read. So that is kind of the main point of the optionals. we simply create like a holder, item holder class that contains our items. And we can then either set this optional, which contains our item, to be empty, or optional.off some value. So in general, in cases like this, where we have some kind of data object that might be null because it's not returned or some mistakes can happen, it's good to use optionals, but again, like with everything else, it has its pros and cons, and it shouldn't be used all the time. So if you enjoyed this quick demonstration, please leave a like and subscribe, and I wish you all a wonderful day.